Hi, let's have another bit of a look about what's going on with acids. Acids, as we know, can be dangerous. They're corrosive. And that's because they contain lots of chemical energy. And the energy tries to get into you if you touch the acid. And that can cause chemical burns. So what we've got to do is to try a way of neutralizing. Now, if we neutralize acids, we take away their power. Alright, and we do lots of other things. So let's find out a little bit more about what goes on. We already know that acids break apart, if you like, or the science word is dissociate, which means to break apart, to form hydrogen ions when they dissolve in water. But it's most important to remember there are other things in there as well, because an acid has several parts. For example, hydrochloric acid has hydrogen and chlorine, or hydrogen ions and chloride ions, and that means that the chloride ions are in there, but for simplicity's sake and for clutter, I'm not going to show them. So essentially we're going to think of a beaker of acid as a beaker that's got H plus ions in it. Even though the other ones are there, we're going to dismiss them at the moment because they don't really take apart. Right. The other thing we learnt in the last lesson was that alkalis, which are soluble bases, also dissociate, if you like, or fall apart into ions. And the main ion we're interested in is the hydroxide ion. And we can see clearly I've got 4 hydroxide ions down the bottom. And they're a little bit different, and this shows up the differences between them even more. I was talked about those in last lessons, but if we look at that one and that one, we see lots of differences in charge and in form. Now, when I've done these colours, I've done them like the universal indicator colours. We know that acids are red and bases tend to be blue or purple. Alright, so we've got these two liquids. What are we going to do? First of all, we need to know one important rule in science, and it's called chemical change. And a chemical change tells me that something new is made. Alright, so we're going to make something new. So we're going to start off with an acid and a base, and we're going to make some new things out of those. And on the way, we're going to take away the power of the acid, so it won't be corrosive anymore. We're going to take away the power of the base, so it won't be caustic anymore. And hopefully we're going to end up with some neutral chemicals. Now by neutral, I'm thinking about the middle of the pH scale. So these things are going to be about 7 in their pH. Okay? So that's what we're going to be talking about. The most important things for us to look at here is that when they form the chemicals involved, they split apart into their parts, and there's normally a positive part and a negative part. And these two ions are then free to move around and then bump into and join with other ions in their solutions. Alright, and this is what we mean by rearranged. The atoms or the ions in the acid might want to come together again, but they might also want to join with some of the ions formed from the base. Now when they do these changes and rearranging, we actually get a new chemical form, and that is what we call a chemical change. And a chemical change has certain things to look for. You can things like it get bubbles, or it gives out some heat, it gets hotter, or it takes in some heat, it gets colder, or maybe it changes colour, or maybe some solid forms from when there was only liquids before. We look for these things to tell us that perhaps we've had a chemical change. But let's stay with neutralising the acid and let's move on from there. So what I've got here is I've got what goes on. Now I suggested to you in the last video on acids that opposites attract, and we've got a positively charged in the acid, a H+, plus being the charge. We've got a OH negative, so negative's a charge, so we've got opposite charges. So if they're lucky enough to bump into each other in my container, in this case I've got a beaker, if they're lucky enough to bump into each other, they will rearrange themselves and we have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, so we form water. Now, pure water is neutral. And that's why I've used the colour. Green is the colour of neutral on the universal indicator pH scale. It's really, really hard to get to green, but it's there. Alright, so we've got the H plus of the acid joining up with the OH minus of the base and making H2O. So we've gone from corrosive plus caustic to neutral. Oh yes, so we've neutralized both the acid and the base. Now one of the common things that would tell us this has happened, and you are going to do this in one of your activities, your lab activities, is to measure the temperature. And you might be surprised what happens with that temperature. I'm not going to spoil the activity by telling you what happens, but I want you to look at the temperature change. Now, in our science class, we have special ways of showing it. We use what's called equations. Sounds a bit like math? Well, it sort of is. And in our equations, we show what we start with over here on the left, and these are called our reactants. Oops, got that way too thick. I'm just going to try to get rid of that. Oops, try to get rid of that. And go to a much thinner. That will do. And see how we go now. They are called reactants. And over here, what we make are called products. And so we can see we started off with these very reactive reactants of an acid and a base, and we've made these more neutral, laid-back products of a salt and water. Now, please don't be confused. At home, you call salt the stuff we put on food or we use in cooking, and it is sodium chloride. But it is not the only salt. In science, a salt is a chemical that is neutral. Now, notice I put these notice I put them because it can be not exactly 7. Alright, but it's close to 7. And that's what we form when we do it. I hope that makes things really, really, really clear, because this is one of the important parts we have to use in our project that's coming up. Maybe we have to neutralize the acid water in the Norwegian lakes, and hopefully now it might be a bit clearer on what we might have to do.